Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. For the couple of you that are new to the group, my name is Lena Blackstock. I facilitated the last module. I think there is a recording of some of the first half of the session available on the resource page. But I'm a researcher by heart and by trade, and I have a background in design ethnography, service design. I've worked both in the public and private sector, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Lily, for holding this space. I will add, if anyone during today's session, which will start with more of a kind of theoretical start, we'll talk about service design and mapping and what it is and how it works. And then the second half, similar to last session, will be more of a practice, work together in small breakout groups session. But if anyone at any moment needs to step aside, turn off your camera, please do so. I'll add a small personal anecdote. I'm actually a German citizen. I've been in the US for 20 years and I became a dual citizen last year. So this is my first presidential election that I got to participate in instead of, feeling the effects of it and the impact of it, but standing on the sidelines. And I will say I feel the gravity and the weight of today. So I will also be trying to take some deep breath in between and if necessary, step aside. But I appreciate you making the space, Lily, for everybody to reflect and just kind of take a deep breath together. All right, so I'm gonna go to screen share. Give me 1 second to pull it up. The meeting is recorded. All right, if you could give me a thumbs up that you can see my screen, that would be lovely. Great, thank you so much. All right. So as I mentioned, this is going to be a 4-hour, mostly interactive workshop, and it follows a similar format from last session. We talked about design thinking last month, and today we're going to talk about service design tools, including journey mapping, process mapping, service blueprinting. I would assume that many of you are familiar with some or all of these to a certain level. So I will try my best to give a kind of 101 introduction to what these are. This might be too shallow for some of you. We will also be applying some of the tools, and I'll share some resources at the end so that those of you who are interested in going deeper or furthering their understanding, you can do so. This is complementary. Service design is a complementary approach and framework to design thinking. And so we'll get into that in a bit. I mentioned this last time and I'll mention it again. I am naturally a very fast speaker. This is the German in me. I can't shake it. So I try to slow myself down. If I do go too fast, feel free to just raise your hand and force me to slow down, but I'm trying. All right, so this is what today's session is going to look like. I will start with a brief overview, like I said, of service design. We'll share a couple examples from both the world of real estate and higher education. We will then take a lunch break and we will go through a series of interactive group activities to first understand and map a service experience, a small view of the ecosystem around the user of that experience. And then we will also map the infrastructure that delivers that experience. And then at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for just Q&A, seeing if there are any pieces you'd like me to go deeper into, any reflections on the content or the session. And then, like I mentioned, some resources that I'll share with everyone. So today we will, like I said, learn about some tools, especially mapping. We will explore how we can apply those in higher education, and we will practice some of those skills. Before I dive into service design, maybe just for a minute, I'd love to hear if there are any thoughts about what you learned in the last module where we talked about design thinking that bubbled up since we last met. Anything that you've been ruminating on or anything that kind of kept popping back into your mind after the session that you'd like to either share or discuss with the group. We do have a couple minutes for that. Maybe anyone has tried applying any of the tools or frameworks, or any questions maybe after sitting with the content. Okay. If there are no questions or thoughts on that, let's dive right in. So what is service design? We'll start there. Maybe a quick show of hand. I'll try to see as many as you as I can in the little squares, but do any of you have familiarity with service design, journey mapping as an approach? Okay, well, we'll get started. Feel free to pause me if anything's unclear. If you have questions throughout, I don't mind. Okay, service design, actually the UK specifically has been applying service design tools and methodologies, especially in government, for quite a while. I would say in general, service design has been applied in government services first. So if I think about the UK, but also Canada, Australia, and then starting more and more in the US, actually. You all might be familiar, but the US government actually passed an executive order, I believe it was 1 or 2 years ago, where they introduced 4 new pillars of customer experience that are going to apply to all government services. And, service design methodologies are a core part of that. So it's coming more and more. And then I think once we saw the value in the approach in government spaces, it started being more broadly adopted by the healthcare and financial industries, and then finally moving into other industries and problem spaces. So with that history, the UK government site, uk.gov, is one that I've leveraged a lot. They have great job descriptions. They have some good frameworks that they've developed and applied. So I reference their site frequently. Their definition of service design is simple, right? Service design is the design of services. Okay, yep, got that. There is a slightly more complete definition, and it's from the Nielsen Norman Group. They say that service design improves the experiences of both the user and employee by designing, aligning, and optimizing an organization's operation to better support the customer journey. And to me, in this quote, the important part is being the focus on both the user and the employee. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the content. So maybe an example, if you consider someone ordering a product online, right? They have an experience with an online e-commerce site. It's a single touch point within their broader shopping experience. They're interacting with a digital product, be it an app or maybe a website. But of course, right, the shopping experience for this customer reaches way beyond that one touch point as they potentially interact with sales staff or customer service. And they experience that service through, let's say, the speed, the quality of the shipping, right? The pickup experience when they go into the store, who they interact with and how. And so as part of this person's shopping experience, there are many staff, tools, processes that are involved in making that happen for them to be able to buy this one item, and interact with this e-commerce. Maybe they also interacted with support staff, like let's say, my login is not working, or, I can't remember my password. And so they are calling up a call center or interacting with somebody on chat. Maybe they use the app to schedule their pickup time, right? So you have a technology team that had to develop that app. You have UX designers, you have the whole staff that's behind the scenes. They might interact with a store staff, right? Like when they go pick up their order. So now you're talking about staff, but you're also talking about management. You're talking about training of that staff. You're talking about facilities. And so when we think about that example, right, service design encompasses more than just one interaction with the ordering platform. Yes, it considers that one touch point, but it also looks at that whole service experience around it, including the customer interactions, plus what we call below the line. We look at the business operations, the processes, the people, and the tools that are necessary to deliver that end-to-end holistic experience. So Lou Down in the UK leads the School of Good Services. I'm a big fan. They are pioneers in the field of service design. I'm going to quote their work a couple times because I think they're doing some of the best work. But they put it this way: your service is where what your user needs to achieve overlaps with the purpose of your organization. And more so, Lou says that our users are often the only ones who know how our services work. They wrote a lot about the challenges in service design, in services being invisible to those who design them, which is why they often aren't designed intentionally. And that's especially true when the service the user is using is facilitated by multiple companies, organizations, or teams, right? Which government faces a lot with very different departments with different focus areas. So that's where it kind of originated, like I said. But even beyond that, most services are designed by accident. And so the consequence of that invisibility is that most organizations often focus on tangible things that they can see, right? We design the product, we might design the system, the process, and portals, but that means that most of the time, service design is just an accidental byproduct of a bunch of decisions we make about those products, those individual products. And that can be influenced by technology compromises, right? Organizational, political trends, personal taste, rather than a conscious, deliberate act where we decide exactly how a service should work. But when you think about it, there are people who can see the services, and that's our users. One more helpful description from uk.gov that I appreciate, so let me read that for you. Services are sometimes split into tiny pieces, lots of isolated transactions, products, and content provided by different parts of government, or right, any organization or multiple organizations that need to be used together by a user to achieve their goal. And then service design is the activity of working out which of these pieces need to fit together and asking how well meet users' needs, and then rebuilding them from the ground up so that they do. It's not complicated, but it is hard. So maybe if we can just reflect real quick about college admissions, which is the example project we leveraged in the last module, and we will be working with again today. How many organizations, universities, service providers, and support people do students interact with throughout that entirety of the college admission journey? Right, and that's just the direct people they might interact with at colleges, financial aid, transcripts, but how many more are involved, right? The student sees their journey through their own experience, but behind the scenes, that below the line, there are tons of organizations with different teams that all have to work together to orchestrate that experience, to make it intentional and not an accidental byproduct. Another one from Lou Down. Again, I'm a big fan of their work, but we talked about what a service is, and she has put together some elements of what defines a good service. And so I'll share a couple of them. Again, this will be in the resources, but a good service is one that is easy to find. Seems very obvious, but when you think about it, right, like, are we considering that when we're designing and delivering services? It's one that enables each user to complete the outcome they set out to do. Clearly explains its purpose. A good service sets the expectations a user has of it, and it works in a way that's familiar, which is really tricky in a digital environment, especially. It requires no prior knowledge to use, and it is agnostic of organizational structures, right? Conway's law, which means that complex products or services often end up shaped like the organizational structure they are designed in or designed for. And so how can we avoid that? A good service requires the minimum possible steps to complete. It's consistent throughout, has no dead ends. It's usable by everyone equally, so accessibility, right? Very big part of this. It encourages the right behaviors from users and staff, both. Again, it's both focus on the experience of the user and the below the line staff and business processes needed to deliver that experience. It responds to change quickly, clearly explains why a decision has been made, and it makes it easy to get human assistance. Which, man, I wish my credit card and bank made it easy to get human assistance sometimes, because those robocalls are difficult, those automated systems. Okay, I'll pause for some questions in a minute. Let me share a couple of the key principles and terminology, because they're already coming out, even though I've tried to avoid saying them. But there's a couple terms that we use in service design that you'll start seeing and hearing, especially if you dive into this world a little bit. So in service design, we often talk about zooming in and zooming out, which means we look at the big picture to understand that full landscape, that full end-to-end holistic experience. And then we zoom into the intricacies of a service. So you'll hear that talk quite a bit about zooming in and zooming out. We also talk about the lines above and below the line of visibility, which refer to the visibility of service activities to the customer. So for above the line, those are the activities that are visible to the customer, such as a support person or a reception desk person. You know, if we think about the online shopping experience, again, above the line is the person shopping and the experience they have with the support person they have to call to say, hey, I can't log into my account, what's going on? Or the store staff member maybe that, you know, gives them their order when they're there to pick it up. And then you have below the line, and those are the activities that are not visible to the customer, but are part of the service delivery. So in the shopping example, again, maybe that's the broader call center, and all the resources that they need access to, the training that they have, all the staff that's involved in delivering that experience, the warehouse workers, right? Supply chain, you talk about management, technology teams who built the e-commerce site, and so on and so on. And then one last way that I wanted to share that's often used in service design in describing this part of the tools, which is through a theater metaphor. So if you think about the theater, front stage is the things that the audience sees. If the audience is the user, it's the parts of a service a user interacts with directly. And then the backstage, of course, is the parts of a play that the audience never sees, but without it, a play wouldn't exist. So, right, lighting, stage design, building props, all that fun stuff. So the front stage is where customers experience and interact with a service. But behind the line of visibility, the backstage plays a crucial role in the delivery of the service. So it's important that we consider both front stage and backstage in any kind of service design if we want to be able to deliver a great service experience. Just another way to put this, right? The stakeholders are the backstage players involved in delivery. The users are the front stage players benefiting from and using the service. And then sometimes we also talk about the customer external stakeholders, which is the audience benefiting indirectly from the service. So if I use the admissions journey example from the last module, the stakeholders would be the teams and organizations involved in delivering the admissions experience. Again, we talked about the departments within the colleges, financial aid, all those different areas. The user would be the college applicant. And then the external stakeholders here would be the parents, maybe other family members, maybe friends. I'll pause before I go into maps maybe. Are there any questions? Is my speed okay? Any thoughts before we move on? Okay, I don't see anything. Again, if you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to just hop off mute anytime. So in service design, we create all kinds of maps. And I think maps are really helpful tools to create a shared understanding, again, especially when we're crossing multiple organizations, teams, government departments, whatever it may be, when we're trying to drive alignment and center the customer or user experience in our organizational or business decision-making. I'll make one note that I think is incredibly important to remember, and especially since you all went through the system session with Jack Hess in Module 1, it is worth reminding ourselves often that these tools are helpful, but the map is not the territory, right? These maps represent models of reality, but they're not the same as reality itself. So again, they're tools that help us in our goals of working together across teams, organizations towards shared goals and outcomes, but they are not a representation of the complexity of reality. All right, I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about maps, and then I believe I have a couple short case studies. We'll take a break and shift into activities after that. So some of the maps that we use most often in service design, there are many more tools and frameworks that we use, but maps are some of the core components of service design. And we often leverage ecosystem maps, process maps, journey maps, and service blueprints. So ecosystem maps, I think you all learned a little and talked a little bit about ecosystem maps with Jack as well, but they are non-sequential maps focused on a system of actors. The goal with those is typically to identify and evaluate interactions and relationships within an ecosystem. And to create these maps, we usually leverage stakeholder interviews and organizational ethnography. The inputs for these maps usually include the key actors, the relationship flows, touch points, or breakpoints. Journey maps, I would say, is the one that probably the most people are familiar with, but it's typically a sequential map of key actors and their narrative through a journey or a pathway. And we use these maps to visualize human dimensions around activities and touch points in an experience, which we usually learn about through ethnography, labs and workshops, immersion journeys, and then stakeholder interviews. The inputs for a journey map, and we'll talk more about that before our activity, are similarly key actors, their activities, what are the key touch points with a service, and then human dimensions like their emotional experience around that and any breakpoints in the experience. Process maps, many of you might be familiar with as well, but they are really just a procedural overview of process steps. And the goal for these is to visualize procedural activities and actors that reach across business processes. So for these kinds of maps, we also leverage stakeholder interviews, immersion journeys, and organizational ethnographies. We look at things like process steps, activities, phases, stage gates can be a big part of process maps, touch points, and breakpoints. And so when you really think about the last couple we talked about, right, we get to service blueprints, which are an operational map of the process activities and interactions below the line, aligned to the user experience above the line. And I want to make this point because I think it's a very important piece of service design, is that we're aligning our business process activities to the user experience, not the other way around. Right? I think sometimes it happens, especially when we have these very complex services and ecosystems, that we try to fit the user journey into our organization's processes, systems, delivery mechanisms, rather than the other way around. We start with the user experience, the ideal user journey, and then we map the below the line elements against that. And so for blueprints, our goal is to visualize and outline processes above and below the line of customer visibility. And we ultimately just want to verify and implement service interactions and that experience overall. And similarly to some of the other, again, we talked about user journey maps and process maps. The inputs for blueprints are those combined, basically. We look at the key actors, the phases, the process steps, the activities, touch points, stage gates, and breakpoints. And we'll be focusing mostly on creating service blueprints today. So journey maps. In order to create journey maps, some of the most important pieces to capture, and these can vary, right? Like there's many different ways to create journey maps, but we want to include usually the phases. How does this experience unfold? And what are the stages of the experience to the user? Not the business people, the user mainly. The users themselves, so who is involved and what are their needs and goals? And so this is where we think about the design thinking session we had last month, and we did the empathy maps. So ideally at this point, you would have a really deep understanding of your target customers or users. You have deep primary research on their experience and their needs and goals. You include typically the emotional experience. So what's the user's perception of their experience as they move through it? Step by step, phase by phase. And then any additional context. So who are other people involved? What type of environments is the user engaging with or within? And then the touch points, right? What are the user's touch points of contact with the business, the brand, the products, or the service? And then for service blueprints, we capture all of that, plus the below the line mechanisms that make all of that experience possible. So again, theater example, the backstage parts are below the line, the front stage parts are above the line. And when you add on the below the line, you look at the people, the processes, and the technology that deliver the service. Often in this work, we can include things like experience principles. You can include things like opportunities, especially when we're working to create future service blueprints. So we think about what are the pain points that can be mitigated or eliminated. Where are opportunities for improvement with the end goal of delivering that better experience to the user. Okay, so before we look at a couple real world examples, I wanted to make a quick note about mapping. I'm a big believer that the true value comes not from the map, as in the noun, but the act of mapping together. And this quote comes from Jim Kalbach, and I think it's an important part of service design and delivery, because mapping experiences and journey is and should be a collaborative exercise. Yes, you need data, and you need to create the right diagram or visualization or map. But if you don't activate your map and make it come alive in your teams, then you're probably missing the point. I think the value is in mapping together because it helps break down silos. Only if you put the diagram into action, right? If you're mapping together. Because if no one in the teams creating the experience is influenced or inspired by the artifact, then it's not working. Jim Kalbach also said that journey maps without collaboration might as well be wallpaper. So that one stuck with me. I have included his book called Mapping Experiences in the resource section at the end. And so you can always check that out if you're interested. And my final point on that is I am always also a huge believer in low fidelity maps, because in order to invite more participation and conversation from teams and individuals, you want to have a space where they feel they can contribute rather than just react to a great looking diagram. That comes later. I think alignment and buy-in comes through looking, understanding, and making things together. And when we only share or invite others in for feedback, once we have this beautiful, polished, high fidelity artifact, what we're basically saying is that it's done, right? Like all the important decisions have been made and there's no more room for big changes. Just give us your yes, okay. But when we step back and we share this in progress, kind of messy, unpolished work, we really invite others into a collaborative shared space with us. And we can not only build a shared understanding of the current state, but we can actually be in a space where we can co-create new solutions. All right, I have two short case studies, and then I believe there's a break. But I'll pause again if there's any questions, thoughts. Make myself drink a sip of water so I remember my pace. So if you have any thoughts, questions, feel free to pop off mute. All right, I will keep trucking along. So we talked a little bit about different kinds of maps, and I will, like I said, share two short examples. The first example shows how a service blueprint can bring together many very different stakeholders to work towards that shared experience for the end user. And then the second example is one I wasn't personally involved in, but it shows how a robust journey map helped higher education organizations in Australia center the student experience through service design. So in this project, the goal was to create connectivity and greater transparency across all the actors that are involved in the home buying experience. This was actually a project up in Canada, but pretty similar to the US market. We worked together with an insurance company, and they serve a multitude of business customer groups with very different needs and very different regulatory restrictions. They worked with lawyers, lenders, realtors, and appraisers, all throughout the home buying experience with different levels of involvement at different stages. And their goal was to, again, create that ideal service experience for the person trying to buy a home. They wanted to deliver that ideal experience to the end consumer, but they did so by focusing on the different business partners that they worked with to deliver that experience. They're a B2B2C company. So for this project, what we did to understand the different business customers' needs was we conducted ethnographic immersions, in-office immersions, which was really fascinating. I got to spend multiple days and weeks in lawyers' office with bankers, with appraisers. And we also facilitated contacts labs with lawyers, lenders, realtors, appraisers, and then also with recent home buyers and people who are looking to refinance, which was another aspect of the project. So in order to make sure that the proposed solutions would work for all these different business customer groups, and then also was feasible from a technology perspective and viable from a business perspective, we worked really closely with the client to co-create the solutions and recommendations. And to me, this is a great example of focusing on the mapping, not the map, and using low fidelity maps. And so there's one moment specifically in this project that I remember when we had a collaborative mapping session with a client who was in the technology group of this insurance group. And he brought in multiple business partners and collaborators to understand all their needs and challenges with this service they were trying to deliver. And they were really involved throughout the whole project, including the research. And so at some point, the client stepped up and he started to explain some of the pain points they had observed to some of his tech team members and some of his management, some of his frontline staff, the support team members. And like within minutes, they just started mapping together, scribbling things out, scratching things out, putting up new Post-its. And they started identifying, like within minutes, how and where their collaborations or the lack thereof had impacted the service and therefore that experience for the end user. And so right then they started coming up with ways to improve their collaboration and the impact that they have on the experience. So the final outcomes of this project were multiple deliverables. So this is actually the full service blueprint that I just used as an example. In addition to an insights report where we delivered some experience principles, these are like guardrails that the client can use internally to make sure that all decisions continuously are designed with the user's needs in mind. One of the biggest pieces of impact for me were creating a shared language for them internally. So having that shared language helped actually align the internal stakeholders and change the way the teams thought and talked about the phases of the home buying experience, which seems like a silly little thing, but it matters because before the project, all the different teams' mental models and internal processes and the language were built around their perception of the experience and the tools they were using, right? So they called one phase was like the acceptance portal. Well, that's not how the customer thinks about it. And so up here, we had actually mapped out the phases. I don't know if you can see my cursor. We had mapped out the phases of how the business customers talked about it, how they internally talked about it, and then how the end user talks about it, right? Like at this first stage, they're dreaming about the dream house and they're thinking about whether they're going to qualify. And so I think the blueprint and the mapping, not the map, enabled all teams to talk and think about the phases and touch points from the perspective of the business customers and the end user, rather than their internal models of things. Okay, there's a second example. It's a project out of Australia and it's in the higher ed space. So even though I was not personally involved here, obviously it's a relevant project, but it's also similar to the current student journey mapping project that I'm working on with the Student Success Collaborative teams. So it's relevant there as well. Again, I wasn't personally involved, but this one was publicly available and I thought is a great example. And it speaks to a lot of the things that we touched on. So this is the story to me of the power of collaborative mapping in higher education in Australia, who suddenly, right, were facing a number of local, national, and global trends and impacts because the journey mapping actually started and took place, I believe, in the middle of 2020. So, right, campuses were being shut down. You all are familiar with the situation. Things moved online. And so a small core team that was led by an agency called Human worked with a much larger group of people from the university community, which included students, important, partners, employees, and they worked together to create a student journey map at a national level, I believe, using the double diamond framework, so design thinking. For a project of that scope, the first step was figuring out, right, where does the student journey start and end? And you all probably know this better than anybody, but it begins way before they're selected to join whatever higher education institution they end up going to. Prior to that, students talk to agents, they communicate with the admissions office, and even before that, they research their options, they look at websites, they talk to friends and family and think about their options. So in this project, they try to involve as many important stakeholders and actors in their work, but the more people work on a mapping project together, the harder it is to get them all in a room at the same time. So the team invited colleagues and partners to a series of kickoff workshops, intentionally creating tons of flexibility and enabling people to just come to one or the other based on their availability. So little things I think can have a big impact in enabling collaboration and creating that space. The goal for them was really to validate that high level, low fidelity draft of what the core team had identified as that end-to-end journey. And what I think was pretty incredible is that they engaged 325 students that provided input and feedback into the project. So not only through research at the front end, but actually in co-creation activities throughout the project. So I believe that included interviews, focus groups, observational ethnographic research sessions, and then diary studies, online activities, getting a wide view. I tried to fit this picture in. This is a massive, massive journey map. You know, with a project this big, it's going to be quite extensive. From what I understand, the finished product that was made publicly available was a document of 10 stages, 39 steps, and 191 touch points. And the thing that I really like, though, is that it wasn't just the publicly made available journey map, but they also found other data and made that available as well. So they had a digitized and hard copy version of the journey map. But then I found a quote from one of the project managers, and I appreciated how they thought about the data collection and the sharing. They said that we were amassing all of this data about the process, systems, data touch points. And so rather than just discarding it, we cataloged, categorized, and mapped that as well. It was kept unpublished as a team deliverable so that we could leverage it for future projects. Our unpublished product was probably more of a service blueprint, and there was just as much value in that for us as a team. So they set out to create a journey map, but because they did such extensive deep primary research, they had enough data to in the end, basically create a service blueprint that they could use internally to redesign and rethink the service delivery aspects. And then the other part of the project that stood out was their approach, which allowed them to zoom in and zoom out. And they said that outside of the published product, they also started getting requests from people for slices and dices of that data, right? For something this comprehensive with this many stakeholders involved, that's not surprising. So that's where they benefited of that really large sample. And other than the aggregated journey map that they were able to produce, they also were able to create samples of different personas, different segments, a particular campus, for example, a faculty or a specific academic group. And so these specific segments or persona groups ended up having a very different experience from the main aggregate journey. And so they discussed how they might apply different treatments, projects, or initiatives to correct that. So, right, they were able to zoom out that aggregate view and then slice and dice and zoom into different parts of that experience. All right, we are a couple minutes before 11, and I would love to take just a minute to see if there's any other questions that have popped up. I can check the cameras and the chat. Looks like there might be one question in the chat actually from Sarah. Did you want to ask that, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just wondering, some of those maps are really visually detailed and compelling. So what kind of software do people use to create those?
So I would say it highly depends on the project and who you want involved in the mapping. Right? If you're thinking about an artifact like that academic journey map, is there a format that is editable by as many stakeholders as possible? So sometimes it can be something as simple as Google Slides for smaller versions, right? For most of the projects that I shared, I worked with designers who created these artifacts, but there are a ton of tools available out there. Actually, a lot of the research tools now automatically visualize a journey. For example, we're using a diary study tool for the admissions journey called Indemo, and part of their software allows me to capture or review the data from each student individually as a journey map and or as an aggregate view and an experience graph. So there's tons of software. I can actually make myself a note and include some of those. But I would also say for these big complex maps, it does work better if you have a designer who can help with information architecture, right? Like where do you want to put the different pieces of information? How do you want to visualize it? How do you make sure it's accessible, editable if needed, and all those things. Oh, and it looks like somebody else has already dropped a bunch of references in the article in the chat. That's great. Thank you so much. Those are great examples.
Thanks.
Any other questions, thoughts, comments? If not, I would say let's take a 5-minute break. It's 10:58 Eastern. Let's meet back. I am German, so I'm going to go with exactly 11:03. You're welcome to hop off mute, hop off camera, and we'll see you back at 11:03.